Yeah, I want to use the first 30 seconds to introduce myself. I mean, most of you know me already, but if you haven't seen me already, so I'm Martin, working for Netconomy and in that Lutz setup since years. Now I'm part of the X team, and I did a lot of performance testing with Gatling in the last years, and also started to building up that Gatling framework and use that quite often also in that Lutz context. But before I go into more details of how we use it in the Lutz context, I will give you some general overview about the tools. So Gatling is, yeah, as you might already know, it's a load testing framework it's quite similar purpose like JMeter. Maybe you heard of that. It was started as plain open source project by one French guy, and now it changed a bit. There is still that free open source version, but they also offer a paid version. They call it Frontline, and it's like it's a paid service. You can host it in-house, but they also plan to set up a software SaaS version that you just buy you buy a subscription and then you can use their servers. In general, it's based on technologies like Scala, Akka, and Netty. It's like, if you compare it, for example, to JMeter, it's based on messages. It's not only on threads. That they say that in performance is a bit better if you produce a high amount of users. For example, you need the machine who creates the load can produce more concurrent users. That's what they say. In practice, it's maybe a slightly better performance like it has with JMeter, but it's really great, and you can simulate a lot of users with one single machine. So on my MacBook, I think I already created 5,000 users at the same time, but it depends on how complex your scenarios are. I will come back to that later. What's good about Gatling, there is a big community, a very active community. So if you have a question, there is a good documentation, you can check the documentation, or if you go to Stack Overflow, you find a lot of questions and also answers. That's really nice. So if you get stuck, that's good. That's not an issue because there is good documentation and a good community. So what is Gatling coming with? Yeah, I already mentioned that it's using messages instead of threads. It's developer friendly. That means there is no UI for clicking together the tests. You need something like IntelliJ or some IDE you use for software developing. If you are used to that, that's really great, because the code and how it looks like, it's really easy to read, because Gatling comes with its own DSL, domain-specific language. It's based on Scala, but you don't need to have much Scala knowledge. If you use the basic functions, you can stay in that DSL what Gatling provides, and you're fine with that. If you want to extend the framework and build custom functions, maybe you need to have some Scala skills, but not that deep skills needed. It comes with if you run a simulation, at the end you get a really nice HTML report. It's I will show you an example later. So that's ready to use. You can see all you need. Since it doesn't provide the UI, but it provides a scenario recorder. So you can start the recorder and go through open your browser. You use the recorder as proxy, click through your scenarios, and it captures all your requests you do. Or if you use Chrome, you can you open the developer tools, go through the scenarios, and then export an HRR file out of that and import it to the recorder. That's good for a start, but based on my experience, you always need to refactor that scripts after that. It's a lot of bloating stuff in there which you don't need. Maybe similar like if you record a UI test, but it's a good start that you see how it can look like, how the scenarios look like. And what's also good about Gatling, it comes with a lot of plugins in the meanwhile. So a Gradle plugin, a plugin for Jenkins. You can use it with the Scala build tool or with Maven. What we did in our framework so far is to use it with Gradle. So have a Gradle build who builds the framework. and integrate it with Jenkins. Used a few plugins there, but since that switched to GitHub, it changes a bit. Let's call it that way. So what are the basic concept if you use Gatling? I mean, that's quite similar if you use another load or performance testing tool. I think you have the same concepts behind. So usually you start with a scenario. That can mean you have different requests, API requests, which you can combine together to a scenario. You can use checks. That means you fire a single request and then check what is the status. Is the status okay or not okay? That's important for load testing because you need to know how was the simulation. For example, check status codes, HTTP status codes, and so on. Then you need some virtual users because it's different to API testing. You don't use a single user. Usually you produce some loads. You have parallel users, parallel requests, and that's you can easily set up with Gatling. Parallel users, maximum amount of requests per second, and all that stuff. Then if you want to use a lot of users, you usually need a lot of test data, for example, files full with product codes and whatever, or a database with product codes and CMS pages and all that stuff, user data. And Gatling uses feeders, they call it feeders for that. So you can, within the simulation, you can say, okay, I will use that feeder, that CSV file where I can randomly put out one data set, for example, or circular and different options. And then usually use assertions. That means after the simulation, you go through all the checks and say, okay, my main response time needs to be below whatever 500 milliseconds that you can assert. And if you run that Gatling in a build tool, for example, the build tool knows now the build is red because it failed or it's green because you fulfilled the assertions. So that's also what you can use. And that all together you can combine in a simulation. So with all that configuration, scenarios, checks, and that's the basic concepts behind. And then I show you some screenshots of an example later, so then it should be more clear. I mentioned the report, so that's a screenshot of the report you get out of Gatling. So you have a global overview about, you can also set that thresholds from 0 to 800 milliseconds and so on, but then you get an overview, green requests, okay, they were fast, not so fast requests. And for the single, grade it out here, and you get whatever, is it okay KO request? KO means you didn't fulfill the check, and then you get times, response times, maximum, mean, percentiles, and so on. So you really get a good overview and also some curves, some statistics. If we have time enough, I can show you a real report from out of our, maybe from the Lutz project. I can search for one. And I mentioned also extended usage. So that's a screenshot from the Jenkins plugin. And one line, okay, I think that was from Mömax, Möbelix, and Lutz. So one line is one rail in that case, and each point of that line is one time when we run the simulation. So you get over the time, over the months, over the weeks, you get the curve, you get some statistics, you see how did the mean response time change over time. That means from release to release, for example. And if you click, I cannot do that because it's a screenshot. If you click on one of the points, you directly open that HTML report I showed before. So that was really nice. And what else is interesting? Gatling has out of the box a graphite interface. That means it can write its data to that graphic interface. That means if you look, if you have a Grafana influx stack, for example, you can in real time see what Gatling response times and that stuff. That's really nice. Or if you already have a monitoring of your target system, you can extend it with the Gatling data you have. Then you can, for example, you can compare what is Gatling measuring and how is the system behaving with that load. That's really interesting and really nice to have using that interface. So now maybe if you now have some more interest in using the tool, what can you do? You can visit gatling.io, that's the homepage, and there is really great documentation there. It's always, even if you know the tool, I often go there and check if there is some command I didn't know before, or if I have a special thing to solve. I really can recommend that documentation. You can also download the precompiled binary version to have a quick start. So you download the binary, and then out of the box you can run at least a demo simulation. And there is, I also linked it here, there is a kind of quick start guide where you get I think it's a one-page document where you get all the information for the quick start. And very interesting, there is an advanced tutorial, and where they tell you how to structure a Gatling script, how to have it more modular. And if you want to start with in this LUTs repository with Gatling, I would really recommend to do that advanced tutorial before, because how the repository is structured, it's based on the principle of that advanced tutorial. It's not exactly the same, but you have 80% of that is out of that tutorial from the basic idea. Do you have questions so far what I can answer before we go into the LUT specific usage?
No, don't think so.
Everything clear. That's good. Yeah, as mentioned before, we use it in our setup since quite a while now. And just a brief overview about the code base. Maybe you get, if you need to open the repository, you know what's going on. There is the source folder, there is a build folder. So every time you run a simulation, the report will be in that build folder. Then we use environments. I think I don't know exactly about this, how the Cypress setup is done, but at least in the WebDriver IO setup before, we had a similar thing, like having an environments folder where we have for the queue systems, for the difference, or production or testing systems, you have, for each system, you have one file where you can find the base URL and specific data. That's also what we use here. And then there is some source Gatling folder with a resources folder. So usually we have test data in a resources folder, configuration files if we need one. And usually in that Scala folder, you find all the simulations, the test objects, and how this is called. And going into more detail, how I set that up. I mean, that's based on that advanced tutorial. If you, doesn't matter if you look at the Kima, the Poseidon, or the XXX LUTs simulations, we always have a simulations folder where, and this contains the simulation which you want to start. That's, I show you the command, I think in one of the next slides. And then we have a scenarios folder where we define the scenarios, and there is an objects folder where we have the real the HTTP requests set that up and so on. It's maybe at the first look it looks a bit over-engineered, but if you have a deeper look, it's really nice to have that split it up and really good to read the repository. And yeah, like I wrote here, that XXXL, it's more or less for the old stack where we use JSPs and that stuff. And interesting for you might be the Poseidon folder. That's if we produce some load for Poseidon or the GraphQL API interface, the things you need are within here. And I also did some tests for the Kima cloud platform in that Kima folder. Since the platform changes, we maybe have to restructure it a bit, or rename it at least from Kima to LUTs cloud platform, because the services at the top stays the same. Okay. Yeah, then I promised you some more details. If you, now we go into that more into that details, objects, scenarios, and simulations. That's how it can look like. Start with the objects. So you can find there for each object, like add the card entry. I have as an example here. So that's Gatling DSL, how it looks like. So you define whatever the name of the, oops, it was too fast. Whoa. My mouse is a bit aggressive. Sorry. You give it the name. You say really that's the endpoint API / GraphQL. You add a file body. So it's really, for me, it's really, if I read that code, it's really clear what's happening. Or you define a header variable, and that's what I call an object, single object. So add the card entry, and then in the scenarios we say, okay, we have a lot of single objects, and we combine it together to one user scenario. For example, I called it here buying scenario. That means, what does the user need to do to buy something? Okay, user opens basic UL, opens a product UL, loads the product via the GraphQL, for example, gets a token, loads the mandant config, and so on. And here in the middle, you can see that add to cart entry, which I defined above. And that's how we combine that objects together to a scenario, for example. Yeah, you can add pauses, for example, if your users are not acting in light speed, then you can also say, okay, add a pause from 2 seconds or 2 to 4 seconds to have a real user behavior. So you can really play around with that, or whatever flash session cookies. If you, after that, if you want to start as a new user, different options. And then what you can do is define that scenarios and put them together in a simulation. I mean, in that scenario at the bottom, I only have that buying scenario, but you can also list a lot of scenarios which you want to use in the simulation. So define the scenario, and at the real bottom, what can you see? Inject users during a specific amount of time, use a special HTTP configuration, say how long the test should take. And so that's in general how this looks like, that stack. Questions at this point? Am I too fast, or do you want to know more details about one of that parts? I mean, it's a lot of information, I know. And no? Yeah, then I will move on. I mean, I can also answer questions at the end. It's not.
Good said. For example, variables like total user in the simulation, you have I think a config file where you
Yes.
maintain this.
That could be part of that environment file, but you can also define it in a different file. It depends on how you want to set up the simulations. In that LUT setup, I have it in the environments file. So I know that for QC system, LUT system, the release test, it's defined there how many users I want to use.
Okay.
I mean, maybe what's also interesting here, if you see that dollar bracket, curved brackets, and some name, that's called Gatling expression language, and that's also in some kind of how you access a variable. That can be a variable you defined during runtime, or also something from a feeder. That's interesting. You can see here as a feed, product feeder, that you, in this case, that uses a CSV file, and in that CSV file, the header is containing product ID, and then it knows, okay, that's my column for product IDs. That's, if you write once a simulation by yourself, you totally know how this works, and it's really straightforward. Or yeah, something like that.
Yeah, really looks like.
In this case, I mean, I can maybe somewhat detail, because in that implementation you cannot see where I used that variable, because I call the query and say product ID, then I get here that variable, and it's hidden in that body. It's a JSON file, and it's called EL file body, expression language file body. So it's also okay to have that placeholder in that JSON file, and then Gatling knows I use that in the JSON file. It's that product ID is defined. So just to close that loop, maybe if you're wondering.
Thank you.
And Martino, the
yeah.
feeder can be as well dynamic, right? You can actually access another API, use that as a variable.
Yes.
For example, in our product, you know, in the testing backend, we sometimes use that.
Should be possible. I mean, you can use a Redis feeder, like you have a kind of Redis database or JDBC connection. It's really flexible here, yeah. Maybe, yeah, something we can use for in the Lutz project using the test backend. Okay. Then I move. Okay, I made a screenshot of the environments folder. We have for each environment, like each system, production, Q system, T system, we have usually one environment file. And yeah, that's it from the environment's perspective. I mean, I can open my IntelliJ later and browse through the files if this helps you, if you have specific questions. But I'm moving on now. Yeah, maybe some release test, some interesting stuff. So what we usually do for each release, we do this since a long time ago. We do for Movelix, Lutz, Moemax, we do a release test on QC system. So have a standardized simulation which we run. On the left side, you can see how this looks over time. So that's from January to May. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 releases. And you can see the average response time for the total simulation and for the specific scenarios like open card or a redirect from open card. And then you see how this is behaving. Like we had a peak there. And then every time you have such a thing, you check the simulation in more detail and try to investigate what's going on. Why is that slower this time or faster? Did we change something in the code? So that's also very interesting from regression testing perspective to look at that numbers, and that's what we did in the past. Yeah, and similar to that report before, that's one single report where you can see okay, it's a bit, you cannot see the full text here, but it's open card, it's a search scenario, open the front page, a CMS scenario, category scenario, and that stuff. And then you can see the statistics for that course. Yeah, that's.
I have a question, a little bit off topic, I think.
No problem.
But the thing is, like if I check the first graph, it rises from 500 to from 400 to 500 milliseconds the response time.
Yeah.
Not the no, that was the request. I'm sorry. Okay, no. So actually, there is no question anymore. I'm sorry.
The blue one is response time and requests per second. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
More requests here. Interesting.
Okay. Nevertheless, the question is I think interesting overall, because like is there a threshold where we start to investigate on why response times are going up, or is it just like a gut feeling where we should investigate or start investigation?
To be honest, there is no hard limit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we do is to compare it with the previous runs, and if the behavior in general is different or whatever, the system is crashing and then recovering, something like that, you see peaks, then we start investigating. But if you use it in whatever, in a built environment, then it makes totally sense to have one threshold. For example, when we did that stock query service stuff, in that case, with the Kuma platform, we had a hard limit, and then we said whatever. I think we had 150 milliseconds for that load, and if we exceed that limit, then the build was red, and then we start some kind of alarm so that we know something is wrong here. That was our business rule, that we say we don't want to have a percentile 95 above that.
I was just thinking about Lighthouse Core, for example, where a slow, gradual increasement of, or in this case, the LiDAR score is getting worse and worse, but only gradually over time. And suddenly we were on 30% instead of 80%, and therefore we had no real threshold there. That's some kind of issue, or was some kind of issue. Now we are working, of course, to get it on track again, but it could happen there as well. So there are people watching, of course, the graph, and we can respond if there's something wrong. That was only the main question.
Yeah, but I think it makes totally sense. For sure, that question, and also having that threshold, and then it's easier to know, okay, now something is wrong, especially if you have frequent deployments. You have a quick checkup, baseline test, and then you see, okay, now it's better, or it's slower than expected. It's good to have that. I mean, what's interesting here, we have that CMS UL, something happened here. We have 2% of broken requests. In that case, we're always investigating, is it the test data which was outdated? Did we open URLs or endpoints which are not existing? And that's always triggering some investigation.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, especially for that release tests, we run them, I think, for 1 hour. So that's the base. In that case, at the beginning, what's interesting, it's a bit, that graph is the response time, it's a bit higher. That's related to cache warm-up. That is the user ramp-up, the orange line. And it's interesting, or it's important that it's a smooth curve. I mean, you have a few, there is no big, you can not see a big spike. That's a good sign. For each release, if we see a spike, response time are going up in after whatever 20 minutes of runtime, we started investigating that. We quite often found issues before, and then fixed it for sure before we went live. That's interesting. Yeah, definitely. Then I move on. If you want, I mean, that's now how we use it with Gradle, the command. It's Gradle, you use the Gradle wrapper, and what you need to know is how your environment looks like, or the name of the environment. Like in this case, it's the Kima production stack level query service endpoint or system. And then you need to know the simulation you want to fire. And that's it. And then it fires it runs your simulation. Out of the box, if you do this in a command line, you cannot see much. You can see just the time elapsed and some kind of global statistics, how many requests were fired and how many were okay and how many not. And as mentioned before, if you want in real time investigate what is the simulation doing, you can use the graphite interface, and then you can have in real time the data, response times for the different requests and that stuff. Don't have a screenshot for that, but if you need it, that's really handy. Then I think I promised some more details, what we did until now in that LUT setup. So I draw the kind of rough overview. I start at the left side, so let's call it the old front end. I think all of you know that old front end. Some Rails are still using that. And that were the release tests I mentioned. But they will, since old front end is getting less and less used, it's dying. And therefore it might make sense for at that layer, GraphQL, BFF, to have that load tests. When we started with that system, we already did some tests, and it's so far it's set up. It's also for Boko, it's enabled. So we should definitely switch soon to that we test at that level and kill that old front end stuff with the release tests. What else did we do? Yeah, some at OCC. At OCC is the interface, how it's called by SAP, Open Commerce, whatever. Maybe Barrio, do you know it? It's Open Commerce somehow interface. It doesn't matter. So at that layer we did tests, and also at that layer, for example, Kima is some kind of that service layer, how I called it. Yeah, we did tests here. Then, for example, if we have MHS connected, we also did during that stock level project, We did some tests at MHS side, or for Boko at the Ametras interface. We also wrote some tests. Yeah, and that's it mainly, how we used it and where we used it. And as mentioned before, for release testing, we should definitely kill that left one, kill that old release test, and move to that load test at that layer, API layer. Do it for all rails and run frequently would be my suggestion. In best case, via some kind of Jenkins, or however we call it, or what we have in GitHub. So sorry, to have frequent tests, and then also set boundaries like Michael mentioned before, to have really fast feedback if something is going wrong or going in the wrong direction. You have questions in the meanwhile? Other questions so far?
Yeah, I have a question. I know that we, okay, since last week, we are not using old front-end anymore. And we, Ashu and Amer, and you helped them as well, established already some Poseidon related Gatling tests. But I have always the issue, I know when I run them and then I get the results, okay, and then I see how much KOs there are and so on, and where I need to investigate, that's clear for me. But it's a little bit hard because it always helped me, like the data from the past, like to get a feeling, is it now serious or not? And for Poseidon, we still don't have it. So is there any advice you can give me or us when to take action here, or investigate deeper or more? Because I don't have the empiric data from the past.
Yeah, usually it makes sense to start with some kind of baseline checks. That means little load, use a low amount of users, and create some baseline. So and then check for sure at the same time, check how is the system, the cloud platform behaving, or the containers or the systems, how many CPU usage, and if this is okay and the baseline looks fast, then that could be a first starting point. Then use the nominal load, like use how many users do we expect from production. Maybe we need to scale it down if the test system or the queue system is weaker. That's something you need to try out, and then create one perfect, let's call it perfect run with the nominal load. And if this looks fine, that could be the reference for the future. That would be my suggestion.
And when you did or wrote the tests initially, in regards to this, how many users and how much load, did you get any, like, I don't know, did you get any values from some stakeholders, or did you just try it out as you already like explained me here?
For that old stack, how it's hosted, or the old system, like it's hosted in Conova, and there was no other system involved, then we knew and we know, okay, live system is that strong, we have that amount of CPUs, RAM, queue system is that strong. So that's one thing we need to know. And the second thing is we had access to access logs. For example, check the access log on a busy day like Black Friday, try to find out, okay, how many users were there, how did they distribute about this, how did they use the different scenarios, how many users entered the checkout, how many product views did we have. And this is the base usually. I mean, in our case, I think we have all the data somewhere, and there are also stakeholders and colleagues which are involved into analytics and tracking. They also can provide good input for that. But what I would suggest is also to do that again, that investigation, and because that's also changing. If for example, Lutz is getting more and more popular and more users are entering the system, and we should adapt our tests that we know if the test is slower, then we really know something is going on. But yeah, the data should be there, tracking and access logs and that stuff.
Thank you.
I mean, I have already some rough idea how we can go on here. Like I already mentioned, switch to that API only tests. yeah, tests are already, most of the stuff is in place, all of the stuff. What could be interesting is the test data generation. Just to give you an idea what I mean, for that old stack tests, the test is using the sitemap. So before, as a precondition before the test simulation starts, it's downloading the sitemap, passing out the, for example, product data and that stuff. And then you have an up-to-date test set, like 50,000 products, which you got from the sitemap, and they should be valid and stuff like that. We need also, I would suggest to have for that API only also, that we have some kind of endpoint where we get a list of products, URLs and stuff, and test data we need in the simulation. Because that's, if you run the tests often, it's handsome if you don't need to care about the test data. Because if you have outdated test data, you have 404s, you have KOs in the test report, and you need to investigate it manually, and that's unneeded work if you have a proper test data setup. And I also would suggest to clean up the actual repository, to remove that stuff which we don't need anymore from the JSP, MVC stuff from the old front end, clean up the environments a bit, yeah, upgrade to the latest tool version, and some maintenance stuff for the repository that we need to do. Yeah, that was my last slide for that presentation. I mean, if you have further questions or want to dig deeper, we have some minutes left.
I would like to ask, the outcome of all this, is this somehow discussed in a guild or something? And are there some actions that the guild take, or you, to improve the performance? Because I think the performance is not that good. It could be better. So what are you doing with all this information you get?
But what do you mean in the past, when we did the release test and we found out that something is not looking good?
No, just now, because you're doing the Gatling test every week or every 2 weeks, I don't know. At least I hear it a lot, or I see a lot of chat posts. They're saying, okay, we start the Gatling tests now for different systems.
Yeah, they are done at least for each release. So that's also done by some of our colleagues here. Maybe they can tell you some more details here.
Yeah, because otherwise I don't understand when it is not reported or some action are taken after the tests. Why are we doing this? You know.
I mean, the action is for sure if the test doesn't look, or if we see some anomaly in the test, like a spike or some failing requests. Usually we start consulting with the deployment master who knows the release and that stuff, and start involving developers if needed to clarify what's going on. That's for sure happening.
Yeah, I think what Stevie meant was that, for example, we have our performance guild, and maybe it would be a good idea just with every guild meeting, okay, just present the latest or like a report about the latest outcomes or the latest results of the Gatling test, and that they are just for reporting, that everyone who attends the performance guild have just a brief look, or can have a brief look on it.
I have a question. Can we just maybe give access to the folders of all those tests, because we are like putting them in a specific SharePoint folder? I don't know if this is okay, but I guess it should be.
I would suggest we aggregate I mean, we built ourselves a report that adds the newest one to that has a history to it. We don't need separate reports for each and everyone. We will maybe aggregate it, and we can see like the change that Martin has shown over time. I think that's the important thing for the performance guild.
What do you mean, just a graph?
Yeah, the graph. But we
How
should
can you
make
put? How
we
can
should
you? How can
just
you use the graph?
automatically. It should generate the graph automatically.
For me, it definitely makes sense to discuss that in that specific round. If for example, performance field sounds like a good idea, yes. But so far, I think that not much happened until now. But it's a good
I was
point
just
in time.
curious. I was just curious how we can use like the data which was done like for the old front end and our old Gatling test with the new ones. I don't think that they are combinable.
You're right. Yes. I mean, there is the tool what I used. I think it's called Gatling Compare, and that from technical perspective, it will not be possible to have that same, to include that in one graph, the old tests and the new Poseidon tests. But if I would suggest, if you switch with the release test, that we do it only for that API Poseidon or GraphQL part, we start with a new reference, and then from that moment on, we can have that graph.
But to answer Stevie's question again, anomalies are pretty pertinent. If you see them, it's like a big spike, and we don't we don't have the absolute numbers gradually over time, but we have relative stuff. And if we see something which is like really spiking, then it's usually a release issue or a release blocker that we need to investigate.
Okay, but the investigation is by yourself, so it's not spread to the Roots developer or something. Or
We create a bug for it,
okay.
and have it as a release blocker. So we communicate it for the high-risk release.
But until now, if you how the tests were set up, it's if there were issues, it's mostly connected to operating or to backend. But if you use it for Poseidon, it makes totally sense. Or for GraphQL, it makes sense, yeah, to have all the people included here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will check or with the head of the guild if we should include this in the future, just like like a short reporting where when in the beginning of the guild meeting, just look through and. But I will discuss it and would come back to you if it's okay.
Yeah.
I'll tell for myself that some releases take so much time that I don't have time for the teamwork at all. I don't know how much of the load that would be, this additional report. And it's, of course, in some way fine. Probably it should be done. But just in case, it could be additional load. Keep that in mind. Sometimes it's not. Some releases
Load or
are very
effort?
easy. Effort,
effort?
whatever, effort. But yeah. But I'll do whatever you say.
I guess if Martin can tell